The Galactic Union had spent over 600 years studying war and the creatures who fought in it. And in all that time, they had never once found a species that surprised them during combat. Until the humans showed up. The organization responsible for this research was called the Quorum of Measured Minds, a scientific body made up of dozens of alien species who had dedicated themselves to understanding violence from a safe and clinical distance. They measured everything. They tracked heart rates and stress hormones and brain activity and fear responses, and they fed all of it into models that could predict exactly when a soldier of any species would break down and stop fighting. Every species had a breaking point. Every species followed the same pattern. Fear would rise and rise and rise until the body could no longer function, and then the soldier would freeze or run or collapse. It was clean and predictable, and the Quorum was very proud of their work. Admitted into the Galactic Union after first contact, the Quorum added them to the research schedule like they did with every new species. They assembled a team of Valith xenobiologists to handle the study. The Valith were tall insectoid creatures with pale translucent shells and 4 delicate arms, and enormous dark eyes that always looked slightly sad. They were one of the most intelligent species in the Union, but also one of the most sensitive. They found violence deeply disturbing, and most of them could not even watch combat footage without needing medical attention afterward. This made them excellent scientists, because they had no desire to glorify what they studied. They only wanted to understand it. The team leader was a researcher named Thys. She had spent 40 years studying the combat psychology of 11 different species, and she had published more papers on the subject than anyone else alive in the Union. She was calm and methodical, and she believed very strongly that every sapient mind followed the same fundamental rules when placed under the pressure of battle. Fear was universal. Panic was universal. The breaking point was universal. Thys was about to learn that she was wrong. The Quorum assigned her team to observe a human military unit deployed to a colony world called Rethval. It was a rocky and dusty planet on the edge of Union space, and it had been suffering raids from a slaver cartel known as the Harrow Compact. The Compact was brutal and well-armed, and the Union had sent a joint peacekeeping force to protect the colonists. The human contingent was a small but experienced group of soldiers, and Thys was told she could pick any one of them as her primary research subject. She chose Sergeant Mara Cole. Mara was 34 years old, and had been a combat engineer for 12 years. She was not especially tall or especially strong. She had short dark hair and a scar on her jaw, and a way of smiling that made it look like she knew. Something you did not. Thys selected her, because her service record showed she had been in more engagements than anyone else in the unit, and had never once been pulled from duty for psychological breakdown. Thys found this statistically unusual. The first step was to implant Mara with a biometric monitoring suite, a tiny, non-invasive device placed just beneath the skin behind the ear. It would track everything: cortisol and adrenaline and heart rate and neural firing patterns and a dozen other indicators that the Quorum used to calculate what they called the Composite Distress Index. The CDI was their masterwork, a single score that told them exactly how much suffering a soldier was experiencing at any given moment. It worked on every species. It had never failed. Mara sat in the medical bay while a Valith technician installed the device. She did not flinch. She did not ask questions about what it measured. She just sat there and watched Thys with those calm, dark eyes. Then she said something that Thys did not understand at first. "So you are the bug who is going to watch me fight, huh?" Thys stiffened slightly. The word bug was not in her cultural vocabulary, and she was not sure if it was an insult or a greeting. Her translator offered several possibilities, and none of them were flattering. "I am Senior Researcher Thys," she said carefully. "I will be monitoring your biological responses during combat operations to contribute to the Quorum's understanding of human stress physiology." Mara grinned. "Yeah," she said, bug who watches me fight. That's what I said." From that moment on, Mara called her Doc Bug. Fiss noted this behavior in her log. She wrote that the human subject displayed a tendency to use humor as a coping mechanism, and that this was likely a form of emotional suppression. She had seen similar patterns in other species. Creatures that joked before battle were usually the ones most terrified of it. Laughter was a mask, and Fiss was confident that when real combat began, the mask would fall away, and the true readings would emerge. She was certain of this, because she had seen it happen 100 times before, with 100 different species. The jokes always stopped when the shooting started. Fiss prepared her monitoring station aboard the orbiting research vessel. She calibrated every instrument. She tested the signal from Mara's implant and confirmed it was transmitting clearly. She reviewed the quorum's predictive models for a species of human size and metabolism, and she noted the expected stress curve: a steep rise during the approach to combat, a sharp spike at the moment of first contact with the enemy, and then a rapid escalation toward the breaking point. She estimated that Mara would reach critical distress levels within 8 to 12 minutes of sustained combat, based on her body mass and hormonal baseline. This was consistent with most species of similar physiology. Fiss filed her predictions with the quorum, and marked the study as ready to begin. That night, she sat alone in her quarters aboard the research vessel and looked out at the dusty brown surface of Rethval below. She thought about the human sergeant, and her strange smile, and her jokes, and her calm, dark eyes, and she felt a small prickle of something she could not quite name. It was not concern exactly. It was more like the feeling she got when she opened a data set and the first few numbers did not quite match what the model predicted. It was the feeling that something was about to go sideways. She dismissed it. She had been doing this work for 40 years, and the models had never been wrong. She turned off the lights and tried to sleep. Far below, on the surface of Rethval, Mara Cole sat on the roof of the barracks and looked up at the stars, and cracked her knuckles one by one. She could feel the tiny device behind her ear humming softly. Smiled that smile again, the one that looked like she knew something nobody else did. Tomorrow the Harrow Compact was expected to hit the eastern settlements. Mara was looking forward to it. The alert came at dawn. Fiss was already at her monitoring station when the signal flashed across the tactical board. The Harrow Compact had hit a frontier settlement called Outpost Rena, about 40 kilometers east of the main colony. They had come in fast with ground vehicles and foot soldiers, and they were already rounding up civilians by the time the peacekeeping force got the call. Mara's squad was loaded into a drop shuttle within 6 minutes. Fiss watched the biometric feeds light up on her screen as 12 human soldiers strapped into their seats, and the shuttle lifted off the ground and banked hard toward the east. The readings were exactly what Fiss expected. Heart rates were climbing across the board. Adrenaline was spiking. Cortisol was flooding into bloodstreams. The composite distress index for each soldier was rising steadily along the predicted curve, and Fiss allowed herself a small moment of professional satisfaction. Perfectly. The humans were afraid just like every other species, and the data was going to confirm what the quorum had always known. The shuttle hit turbulence as it crossed into the combat zone, and then something worse: anti-aircraft fire from the ground. The shuttle shook hard, and a warning light flashed. The pilot cursed over the intercom and banked sharply to avoid a second shot. Fiss watched the distress readings spike higher. This was the approach phase, and every model said the fear would keep building from here. The moment the shuttle doors opened and the soldiers stepped into real danger, the readings would jump again, and then they would keep climbing until the breaking point. The shuttle dropped altitude fast and touched down hard in a field of dry red dirt about 200 meters from the settlement. The rear doors slammed open, and hot dusty air rushed in. Fiss could hear the distant crackle of weapons fire. This was the moment. She leaned forward and watched the screens. The readings for the entire squad did something she had never seen before in 40 years of research. They stopped climbing. For a single heartbeat, every number on every screen seemed to pause as if the universe itself was taking a breath. And then the readings began to fall. Not back to baseline. That would have suggested the threat was gone, and it clearly was not. The soldiers were stepping out of the shuttle into an active combat zone, with bullets snapping through the air and explosions echoing off the buildings. There was no reduction in danger. The danger had just increased dramatically. But the stress readings were going down. Fist checked her instruments. She ran a diagnostic. She checked the signal from Mara's implant and confirmed it was clean and strong. She looked at the raw data, and then she looked at the processed data, and then she looked at the raw data again. Mara's heart rate had dropped from a rapid, anxious rhythm into something slow and steady and powerful, like a drum beating underwater. Her cortisol levels were falling. Her adrenaline was still elevated, but it had shifted into a pattern that Thys had only ever seen in her studies of species engaged in non-threatening recreational activities, hunting for sport, or playing competitive games, or solving complex puzzles for entertainment. And her neural activity. Thys stared at the neural activity readout for a long time because it did not make any sense at all. The regions of Mara's brain, associated with fear and panic and survival anxiety, had gone almost quiet. The regions that were lighting up instead were the ones linked to focus and spatial reasoning, and something that the Valeth emotional mapping system could only translate as deep satisfaction. Mara was moving through the settlement now. Thys could track her position on the tactical display. She watched the sergeant breach the door of a building with a sharp kick and sweep inside with her weapon raised. She cleared one room and then she encountered two Harrow compact fighters in a hallway. And she engaged them with 3 precise shots, and kept moving without breaking stride. Her voice came over the squad radio, calm and clear and almost casual. 2 down in Building 7, moving to the next block. Watch the rooftop on my left. Someone has been shooting from up there. She sounded like she was giving directions to a restaurant. Thys pulled up the composite distress index for Mara, and stared at the screen. The CDI was designed to display one of several standardized results, based on the combination of all biological indicators. It could read, subject is calm, or subject is stressed, or subject is distressed, or at the extreme end, subject is critical. These were the only categories the system had been designed to produce, because in 600 years of research, no species had ever produced a reading that fell outside of them. Mara's CDI display was showing something Thys had never seen before. The system had clearly tried to categorize the data and failed, and it had fallen back on a raw linguistic interpretation of the combined indicators. The screen read, subject is enjoying this. Thys blinked her enormous dark eyes. She tapped the screen. She ran another diagnostic. She checked the calibration files. She checked the translation matrix. She did everything she could think of to find the error. There was no error. She sat back in her chair and watched as Mara moved through the settlement like water flowing through a broken pipe, smooth and fast and finding every gap. She watched the sergeant pull a wounded colonist behind cover and check their injuries with quick, efficient hands, and then stand up and shoot a compact fighter who had been trying to flank them, and then crouch back down and finish bandaging the wound. All with that same steady heartbeat, all with that same quiet, neural hum of satisfaction. All with a CDI reading that said she was having the time of her life. The engagement lasted 41 minutes. By the end of it, the Harrow compact fighters had been killed or driven off, and the colonists had been secured, and Mara's squad was sweeping the area for stragglers. Thys had recorded every second of data, and she had checked it and rechecked it, and she could not find a single fault in any of it. She opened her research log and began to type her notes. She started with the standard header and the date and the mission designation, and then she paused, because she did not know what to write. In 40 years, she had never been at a loss for words in a research log. She always knew what the data meant. She always knew how to categorize it, and file it, and connect it to the models. She stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. Then she typed, "Possible instrument malfunction during engagement. Readings inconsistent with all known. Models of sapient combat stress response. Recommending full diagnostic of monitoring equipment before next observation." She saved the log and closed it, and sat in the dim blue light of the monitoring station, and listened to the quiet hum of the ship around her. She knew it was not an instrument malfunction. She had known it from the moment the readings started to drop. She had known it in the part of her mind that was not a scientist, but simply a living creature with good instincts. And she had felt it in the way her 4 hands had gone cold and still when she saw the words on the screen. Subject is, enjoying this. Thys was afraid, and she was not even the one fighting. Far below on the surface, Mara sat on a crate outside the settlement, and drank water from a canteen, and laughed at something one of her squadmates said. Her hands were steady, her eyes were bright. She had dust in her hair, and someone else's blood on her sleeve, and she looked more relaxed than she had at any point in the 3 weeks Thys had been observing her. The most relaxed reading Thys had recorded for Mara Cole was not during sleep or rest or recreation. It was during combat. Thys turned off her screens and sat in the dark and thought about what that meant for a very long time. Thys did what any good scientist would do when faced with data that should not exist. She tried to prove herself wrong. She spent 3 days running every diagnostic she could think of on the monitoring equipment. She replaced the signal processors. She recalibrated the composite distress index algorithm. She even had a second implant installed in Mara's other ear, just to cross-reference the readings. She tested the equipment on 2 Valeth volunteers, and confirmed that it still produced normal stress responses in normal subjects. Everything was working perfectly. The equipment was fine. So Thys expanded the study. She went to the human commanding officer, Captain David Osei, and requested permission to implant biometric monitors in additional human soldiers. Osei was a tall, broad man with a deep voice and kind eyes, and he looked at Thys for a long moment before he said, "You saw something in the data that scared you, didn't you?" Questioned directly. She said she needed a larger sample size for scientific accuracy. Osei smiled the way humans smiled when they knew you were not telling the whole truth, but decided to let it go. He approved 18 additional subjects across 3 different squads. Over the next 4 weeks, the Harrow Compact continued their raids on the colony. The attacks grew worse. Ambushes on patrol routes, improvised explosives buried in roads, night raids on outlying farms. Each engagement was more dangerous than the last, and each one gave Thys more data. The results destroyed everything she thought she knew. It was not just Mara. Every single human soldier showed the same pattern. The stress and fear built during the waiting, during the hours and days between fights, when they did not know when the next attack would come. That was when the humans suffered most. Their cortisol was highest when they were sitting in the barracks, playing cards, or eating meals or trying to sleep. Uncertainty was what ate at them, the not knowing. But the moment the alarm sounded and the fighting began, something changed inside them. It was like watching a machine switch from one mode to another. The fear did not disappear exactly. It was more like it was picked up and moved to a different part of the brain, where it could be used as fuel instead of poison. Their heart rates would settle into that same slow, powerful rhythm. Their focus would sharpen until their neural scans looked like laser beams. Their reaction times would drop to levels that the Quorum's models said should only be possible under heavy chemical stimulation. And in the most dangerous moments, the close calls and the ambushes and the desperate fights where death was breathing down their necks, Their brains would light up with activity in the regions associated with pleasure and reward and deep engagement. They were not just tolerating combat, they were entering a state of flow, the same state that other species achieved during art or music or intellectual discovery. The humans were reaching while people were trying to kill them. Fis mapped the pattern carefully, and she found something else that shook her even more deeply. The enjoyment was not random. It was not mindless bloodlust. The neural signatures were specific, and she could see exactly what was triggering the reward responses. It was competence. The pleasure centers activated most strongly when a human soldier did something skillfully, when they made a perfect shot, or executed a flawless tactical maneuver, or solved a problem under pressure in a way that saved lives. Their brains were rewarding them for being good at the thing that was keeping them and their companions alive. It was not that they enjoyed killing, it was that they enjoyed the intense, focused application of skill under maximum pressure. They enjoyed being excellent when it mattered most, and then the fighting would end, and the switch would flip back, and everything they had deferred would come flooding in. Fis watched it happen again and again. A soldier who had been laughing and moving like a dancer during a firefight would sit down afterward and go completely quiet. Their stress readings would spike far above combat levels. Their hands would shake, they would stare at nothing. Some of them would find a place to be alone, and Fis would watch their readings and know they were crying. The humans had a tax on their gift, and they paid it every single time. Fis compiled her findings into a preliminary report and submitted it to the quorum. She was careful and thorough, and she included all of her methodology and all of her raw data, and she made her conclusions as measured and conservative as she could. The quorum rejected it within 2 days. The response came from a committee of senior researchers who said her data was inconsistent with established models and likely the result of equipment calibration, errors or cultural misinterpretation of neural mapping. They recommended she rerun her diagnostics and resubmit with corrected data. Fis had expected this. She had spent 40 years in the quorum, and she knew how institutions worked when faced with information that threatened everything they had built. They did not accept it. They could not accept it, because accepting it meant admitting that 600 years of research had a hole in it big enough to fly a warship through. But she did not resubmit corrected data, because there was nothing to correct. Instead, the quorum sent someone to correct her. His name was Arch-Assessor Polen, and he was the highest-ranking researcher in the quorum's combat psychology division. He was a Valith like Fis, but older and larger, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. He arrived on the research vessel with 2 assistants and a look on his face that suggested he expected to find incompetence and fix it quickly. Polen settled up in the monitoring station and waited for him to come soon. Watch the readings yourself, and her equipment. She did not argue with him. She did not defend her findings. She simply said, "The next engagement will come soon. Watch the readings yourself." Polen settled into the monitoring station and waited. The Harrow Compact attacked the next morning. Polen watched the data come in live. He watched 18 human soldiers drop into combat, and he watched their stress readings do exactly what Fis had described. He watched the fear transform into focus. He watched the distress index fall where it should have risen. He watched neural patterns shift into configurations that should have been impossible under fire. And then he watched Mara Cole. An explosion went off 3 meters to her left. Close enough to kill. Close enough that the shockwave should have sent her into full panic. The blast threw up a wall of dust and debris, and Mara did not freeze or run. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that came through the audio feed like a bark, and then she used the dust cloud as concealment and sprinted through it to flank the enemy position, and she took out 2 fighters before they even knew she had moved. Her CDI reading at that moment showed the highest enjoyment markers Fis had ever recorded. Polen sat very still for a very long time after the engagement ended. He did not speak. He did not move. He just stared at the screens with his enormous dark eyes, and Fis could see the reflection of the data in them. Finally he spoke, and his voice was quiet. "Pull every model we have, every species profile, every combat psychology study in the archive. I want to know if anything like this has ever been recorded in any species in the history of the Quorum." His assistants worked through the night. They searched 600 years of data across hundreds of species and thousands of. They found nothing. No species in the known galaxy had ever shown a reduction in combat stress during active engagement. No species had ever displayed pleasure responses under mortal threat. No species had ever converted fear into fuel in the way that humans apparently did, as naturally as breathing. Polen looked at Thys across the monitoring station in the pale blue light of the screens, and he said, "What are they?" Thys did not have an answer, but she was beginning to think that the answer, whatever it was going to change everything the Galactic Union believed about war and the creatures who were best at it. The Haro Compact had been testing them, and everyone knew it. The weeks of raids and ambushes had not been random violence. They had been probes, small attacks designed to measure the defenses and find the weak points, and calculate exactly how much force would be needed to crack the colony open like an egg. On a cold, gray morning, 6 weeks into the deployment, the Compact stopped testing and started hitting. The attack came from 3 directions at once: ground vehicles and infantry, and air support, all slamming into the main colony at dawn. The colony's sensors counted over 2,000 Compact fighters against a peacekeeping force of roughly 500. The Union's orbital communication relay was jammed within the first 10 minutes, which meant no calls for reinforcement. No one was coming to help. The tactical officer on the research vessel calculated that reinforcements from the nearest Union outpost would take 72 hours to arrive, even if they somehow got a signal through. Polen stood beside Thys at the monitoring station and looked down at the surface of Rethval, where the colony was already burning in several places. He said, "This will be the true test. No species maintains combat effectiveness under sustained, overwhelming assault for 72 hours. The humans will break here. The data will normalize." Thys said nothing. She was already watching the screens. The first 12 hours were chaos, but controlled chaos. The human soldiers fell back to prepared defensive positions around the colony center, and they set up overlapping fields of fire and barricades, and they began the grim work of holding a line that was too long with too few people. Thys tracked the biometrics, and she saw what she expected to see: elevated stress across the board, high adrenaline, elevated cortisol. The CDI readings were in the upper range of what the Quorum would classify as stressed, which was exactly where the models said they should be for the opening phase of a siege. But even in those first hours, small things stood out that made Polen's assistants exchange nervous glances. The humans rotated shifts. Even in the middle of a siege, they made each other sleep in 4-hour blocks. They shared food and water, not just among themselves, but with the alien peacekeepers fighting beside them. They made jokes, dark, terrible jokes that the Valith translators struggled to process. And the jokes seemed to work, because the humans who laughed fought better afterward. During a brief pause in the fighting, Mara found the Valith medic assigned to her sector, a young researcher named Saul, who was trembling so badly he could barely hold his medical kit. Mara sat down beside him and pulled a deck of cards from her vest and taught him how to play a human game called poker. Saul's hands were shaking too hard to hold the cards properly, so Mara helped him, and she explained the rules in a slow, patient voice, and for 20 minutes she kept playing. The war outside the barricade might as well have not existed. Saul's stress readings dropped by 30% during that card game. Mara's had never been high to begin with. Hour 30 changed everything. The compact breached the eastern perimeter and poured through the gap, and suddenly there were enemy fighters in the streets between the buildings. And the battle became close and personal and savage. The tactical displays turned into a nightmare of overlapping signals, and the neat defensive lines dissolved into dozens of small, desperate fights scattered across the colony. Fis watched the biometric readings, and she saw the shift happen. Every human soldier's data changed at the same moment, as if a signal had been sent that only they could hear. Their heart rates dropped into that slow, powerful rhythm. Their neural patterns snapped into the flow state. Their CDI readings fell out of the stress range and into the zone that Fis had started calling the burn. Maximum aggression and maximum focus and minimum fear, all wrapped together into something that looked on the screens like a predator waking up. 3 human squads, fewer than 40 soldiers, held a defensive position at the colony's central plaza, against a compact force that the tactical models said required a full company of 150 to hold. The models were wrong. The humans held it with 40, and they did not give a single meter. Mara was everywhere. Fis tracked her moving through the streets like a ghost, appearing behind enemy positions and dismantling them, and then vanishing into the dust and smoke before anyone could react. Her readings were deep in the enjoyment zone, and her movements had a quality that Fis could only describe as elegant, as if she had been practicing for this her entire life and was finally getting to perform. Hour 48 broke Fis's heart. The compact launched a wave of incendiary attacks, and several buildings caught fire, and inside one of them were wounded soldiers and colonists who could not move. Mara heard the screams over the radio, and her biometric readings did something Fis had not seen before. For the first time in weeks, Mara's stress readings spiked into genuine distress. Not combat distress, not the clean, sharp focus of someone facing a threat to themselves. This was something different. This was raw, anguished, empathic pain, her brain lighting up in the regions associated with grief and helplessness and desperate need. She was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for others. Mara sprinted through open ground under enemy fire to reach the burning building, and she went inside and she carried out 2 wounded colonists one at a time. And then she went back a third time for a Valith peacekeeper who had been trapped under debris. Her own danger readings stayed in the flow state the entire time. It was only the readings connected to others, to empathy and compassion, and the agony of watching someone else suffer, that were screaming. Fis wept at her station. She did not realize she was doing it until Polen quietly handed her a cloth. Hour 60. The ammunition was running low. The human soldiers had been fighting for 2.5 days with almost no sleep. Their bodies were running on reserves that the Quorum's models said should have been empty 20 hours ago. But they were still fighting, still holding, still cracking those terrible jokes over the radio. Captain David Osei got on the communications channel and spoke to every human soldier in the colony. His voice was calm and warm, and it carried a weight that made even the Valith researchers stop and listen. "Listen up," he said. "Reinforcements are 12 hours out. We have held this line for 60 hours against an enemy that outnumbers us 4-1. They expected us to break, and we did not. They expected us to run, and we did not. Now they are tired and frustrated and scared because they have thrown everything they have at us, and we are still here. You know what that makes us? It makes us the wall, and walls do not move. I expect every one of you to have a good story to tell when this is over. So, go make one." The biometric readings for every human soldier in the colony spiked simultaneously into the enjoyment range. Not just Mara, not just the experienced fighters. Every single one of them, from the veterans to the ones on their first deployment, heard those words, and something inside them caught fire. Fis stared at the screens, and she understood for the first time that she was not watching soldiers. She was watching a species that had evolved to be most alive in the moments when everything was trying to kill them. They held. Hour 72. The sky above the colony lit up with the drives of incoming Union warships, and the Harrow Compact broke and ran, and it was over. Mara sat down with her back against a wall and her rifle across her knees. She closed her eyes, and then her stress readings did what they always did after the fighting stopped. They exploded upward. Everything she had held back for 3 days came rushing in like a tide. The fear and the grief and the exhaustion and the faces of the people she could not save. She was shaking. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was racing faster now in the silence than it had at any point during the battle. Thys left the monitoring station. She took a shuttle down to the surface. She walked through the ruined streets of the colony until she found Mara sitting against that wall. She sat down beside her. Mara did not open her eyes. She just said, "Hey, Doc Bug." Thys did not say anything. She reached out with one of her 4 delicate arms and placed it very gently on Mara's shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, while the dust settled and the fires burned out, and the cost of survival made itself known in every trembling breath Mara took. Had spent 40 years studying what combat did to living things. She had always studied it from a distance, through screens and data and clinical language. This was the first time she felt it, and she understood now that the data had never been wrong. The humans really did enjoy the fight. They really did come alive in the fire and the chaos and the desperate, beautiful struggle to survive. But the price they paid afterward in the quiet, was more terrible than anything the Quorum had ever measured. The chamber of the Galactic Quorum was the largest enclosed space in the Union capital, a vast domed hall carved from pale stone, with seating for over 3,000 delegates, arranged in concentric rings that rose from the floor to the ceiling like the inside of a shell. It had been built 600 years ago, when the Quorum was founded, and it had hosted every major scientific presentation in the Union's history. Today it was full. Polen stood at the central podium and looked out at the assembled delegates, hundreds of species from every corner of the galaxy, their translators humming softly as they waited for him to speak. He had spent 3 weeks preparing this presentation, and he had rehearsed it dozens of times, and he had run every possible counter-argument through his mind, until he was certain he could answer any challenge. But standing there under the lights, with 3,000 pairs of alien eyes on him, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Afraid. Not of being wrong. He was not wrong. The data was flawless, and the methodology was sound. And Thys had done work that would be studied for centuries. He was afraid because he understood what his findings meant. And he knew that once he said the words out loud, the galaxy would never think about humans the same way again. He began. He started with the basics. The Quorum's 600-year history of combat psychology research, and the models that had successfully predicted the behavior of every sapient species ever studied. He walked through the methodology of the Rethval study, and he presented the biometric data clearly and without editorializing, and he let the numbers speak for themselves. The chamber was quiet at first. The delegates watched the charts and the graphs and the neural mapping displays with the calm attention of scientists reviewing data. Then the CDI readings appeared on the main display. Those impossible readings that showed stress dropping during combat and pleasure centers activating under mortal threat. And the quiet changed. The quiet became the kind of silence that happens when 3,000 intelligent beings all realize at the same moment that something fundamental has shifted. Polen let the silence sit. Then he delivered his conclusions. Humans, he explained, did not experience combat the way any other known species did. They did not fight despite their fear, in the way that brave soldiers of other species fought despite their fear. Other species experienced fear as a poison, something that accumulated in the body and the mind, and eventually overwhelmed the ability to function. Courage for those species meant enduring the poison as long as possible before it destroyed them. Humans did something entirely different. Their brains under combat conditions underwent a neurological transformation that had no equivalent in any other species on record. The fear did not go away. It was still there. Cortisol and the adrenaline and the racing heart were all present. But instead of accumulating as a toxic force, the fear was rerouted. It was picked up from the parts of the brain that caused panic and paralysis, and it was moved, physically, chemically moved, to the parts of the brain that governed focus and problem-solving and reward. They converted terror into fuel. Polen explained that this was almost certainly an evolutionary adaptation. Humans had evolved on a planet that was by galactic standards extraordinarily hostile. A world of predators and natural disasters, and extreme climate shifts, and constant competition for survival. Their ancestors had not been the strongest or the fastest creatures on their world. They had survived by being the most adaptable and the most persistent and the most dangerously clever when cornered. Over millions of years, their brains had developed this extraordinary trick. If you cannot outrun the thing that is trying to kill you, then your brain had better make sure you can outthink it. And the best way to outthink a threat was to stop being afraid of it and start being fascinated by it. Start treating it as a problem to be solved. Start enjoying the challenge of survival itself. The result was a species that did not merely tolerate combat, but entered a state of heightened performance during it, a flow state that other species could only achieve during peaceful activities. The humans were most capable, most focused, and most creative at the exact moment when everything was trying to kill them. A murmur ran through the chamber. Polen waited for it to pass. Then he said the part that he knew would matter most. But this gift is not free. He put the post-combat data on the display. The readings from after the fighting stopped. The stress spikes that dwarfed anything recorded during battle. The shaking hands, and the hollow eyes, and the readings that showed grief and guilt and exhaustion flooding in like water through a broken dam. Humans paid for their combat transformation, and they paid for it afterward. Every moment of clarity and focus and impossible calm during the fight was borrowed from the future, and the debt came due the moment the guns went quiet. Their bodies kept a perfect record of everything they had experienced and deferred, and when the danger passed, the record was delivered all at once. They had a word for this debt, Polen said, a word that no other species had ever needed to create, because no other species experienced anything like it. The word was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the scar that combat left on the human mind, not during the fight, but after it, a wound that could last years or decades or a lifetime, a wound that was the direct and unavoidable cost of the variability that made them so extraordinary in battle. The chamber was completely silent. Polen looked out at 3,000 delegates and he said, "They are not unbreakable. They break. But they break afterward. They break when the people around them are safe. They break in private, in the dark, in the quiet hours when there is nothing left to fight. They hold themselves together when it matters, and then they fall apart when no one is watching. That is not a flaw in their design. That is the most selfless adaptation I have ever encountered in any living thing." He paused, and then he made his recommendation. The quorum must reclassify humanity. They do not belong in the standard combatant species category. That category was designed for species that fight to survive. Humans do not merely fight to survive. They fight, and they thrive, and they transform under pressure in ways that our models cannot predict or contain. They must be reclassified as an apex adaptive threat, and they must be handled with the highest diplomatic priority. Because the worst thing this union could do, the most dangerous mistake any civilization could make, would be to give this species a reason to fight. The vote was held the same day. It passed with 94% approval. Humanity was reclassified. Apex adaptive threat. Handle with diplomatic priority. But it was the footnote that became famous. Fis had been given the honor of writing the closing annotation on the new classification file, and she had spent a long time thinking about what to say. She thought about the data, and the models, and the charts, and the neural maps. But in the end, she did not write about any of those things. She wrote about what she had seen with her own eyes, and felt with her own heart. Sitting on the ground next to a shaking human woman, in the ruins of a colony that should have fallen, but did not. She wrote, "Recommendation, do not go to war with humans, not because they will fight you, every species will fight when cornered, but because part of them will enjoy it. And the part that does not enjoy it will hate itself for the enjoyment afterward." Are not monsters. They are something far more complex than monsters. They are people who become extraordinary when the world demands it, and then carry the weight of that transformation forever. They pay for every moment of brilliance with a lifetime of remembering. Show them kindness. They have earned it in ways this quorum is only beginning to understand. The file was sealed and distributed to every member world of the Galactic Union. It was translated into 11,000 languages. It was studied and debated and argued over for decades, and it changed the way the galaxy treated its newest members. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of careful respect that had not been given to any other species in the Union's history. On Earth, 3 months after the siege of Rethval, Mara Cole was sitting in her apartment in the early hours of the morning, unable to sleep again. She was staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet sounds of a world that was not trying to kill her. Finding, as she always did, that the quiet was harder than the noise. Her communicator buzzed on the bedside table. She picked it up and saw a message from an address she did not recognize at first, and then she did. It was from Fis. The message was short. It read, "Thank you for keeping us safe, Mara. I hope you are sleeping well." Mara stared at the message for a long time. She read it 3 times. She put the communicator down, and then she picked it up again. And she felt something loosen in her chest. Some tight, hard knot that had been there for months, and that she had stopped noticing because it had become part of her. She typed back slowly, with steady hands. "Getting there, Doc Bug, getting there." She put the communicator down and lay back and closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet did not feel quite so heavy. Somewhere across the galaxy, Fis received the reply and held her communicator against her chest with all 4 hands and closed her enormous dark eyes and allowed herself to believe that the bravest human she had ever known was going to be all right. The data said otherwise. The data said the cost was still being paid and would be paid for years to come. But this had learned something on Rethval that 40 years of science had never taught her. Sometimes the data does not tell the whole story, and sometimes hope is not a number on a screen, but a small message sent across the stars by someone who cares about someone else enough to ask if they are sleeping well. That was worth more than anything the quorum had ever measured.